Several hours later, once the fight was over, the spectators left the building and some fell asleep, while others were still drinking alcohol. At that moment, Cyan and Karam arrived in the city, where everything was chaos. The ground was very dirty and people were sleeping in the streets. Karam, who had her hands behind her head, thought this was a very dirty place. Cyan, who was walking next to her, mentioned that Lewin was a neutral region due to agreements between nations, but this place was impartial because it was totally out of control. Karam stopped walking and with a confused look asked what this meant. Cyan began to show a calm expression and continued walking. At that moment, someone appeared thinking that they had found some precious guests. This was a muscular man. He crossed his arms and his body began to emit a suffocating aura. He started staring at Cyan with an intense gaze, called Karam Miss, and asked if she wanted to go out with them instead of with Cyan. His subordinates began to smile, while on the other hand Cyan and Karam remained silent. Karam, who had one hand behind her head, started to point at herself with the other, and with a confused look she asked if he was talking about her. Cyan began to observe the man with a serene look and explained that the reason why this place was out of control was because there were a lot of criminals. The man's eyes filled with excitement. With a smug smile he told Cyan to prepare well since they were a bit rough, advising her that it was better to get lost. Instead of being afraid, Cyan remained calm and his eyes filled with confidence, causing him to start smiling. After a while, the criminal, who had bumps and bruises all over his face, fell to the ground and began to cry, thinking that he had messed with the wrong person. After defeating the criminals, who were lying on the ground one on top of another, Cyan put on the hood and Karam transformed. Both turned their backs on them and started walking. After a few minutes, Cyan went to a hotel, placed a bag full of coins on the counter indicating that he wanted the best room. The receptionist, who was a woman with brown hair, became somewhat confused and with a surprised look asked him how old he was. Cyan grabbed the bag of coins tightly and asked if she hadn't heard him. He started looking at her with a disdainful look and reminded her that he had told her he wanted to book the best room for one person. Asking if this was how they treated their customers, he wanted to know who owned this place, making everyone's attention focus on him. Upon hearing this, the expression of the receptionist changed, and her eyes filled with surprise, leaving her somewhat in shock. She apologized, put her hands on her abdomen and welcomed him to the lambaster cage. Several minutes later, Cyan arrived at the new room he had reserved, approached the window and saw a carriage and several men outside. He couldn't help but be somewhat surprised to see that they had finally started to arrive. Outside there were both high-status men and criminals, who had scars all over their bodies and some even had an eye patch. Cyan began to observe them and decided it was time to leave. He left his room, started to descend some stairs and asked the receptionist if her name was Lisa. Upon hearing this, Lisa turned her head back and with a kind smile nodded affirmatively. She was Lisa from Lambaster Cage, asking how she could help him. Cyan descended the stairs, approached her and with a calm look replied that he wanted to use the cage. She began to observe him and remained thinking in silence. With a nervous look she apologized, saying that new clients were not allowed to use the cage. Cyan started staring at her with a penetrating gaze and it didn't take long for him to realize that they must be selling drugs. The reception room was empty. Only Cyan and the receptionist were there. He approached her and asked what had happened to all the clients that were here, questioning if he was the only new client here. Upon hearing this, the receptionist's eyes filled with alertness. Feeling her gaze, Cyan realized that she had a murderous intent. Realizing this, the receptionist quickly decided to pretend. With a look full of guilt, she lowered her head before him and began to apologize, saying that she was just doing her job. Cyan began to observe her with a calm gaze and remained thinking in silence. Then a smile appeared on his face as he realized that this woman was very interesting. He couldn't help but feel excited and his body began to emit a killing mana. He put his hand inside the cloak, started to stare at her and with a smile decided to see what she was so careful about. Lisa didn't take long to feel Cyan's mana. She drew 3 small knives, adopted an offensive stance, began to look at him with a gaze full of surprise and couldn't help but go on alert. With a penetrating look, she extended her hand back and prepared to throw the knives. Upon seeing this, Cyan began to smile and without hesitating for a second started to crouch down. Using all her strength, Lisa threw the knives at Cyan. But at that moment, he threw something into the air, causing the knives to hit it. Upon witnessing this, Lisa's eyes filled with confusion. She did not know what was happening. The object that Cyan had thrown to block the attack was a gold coin, which was now bent in half. Lisa, who was sweating, stood up and started to gasp heavily. She was in shock. The reality was that she had reacted instinctively to the intense murderous intent coming from somewhere. She couldn't believe that Cyan was emitting that intent. Cyan picked up the gold coin, started to clean it, and upon seeing that it was bent, he couldn't help but feel sad. Upon seeing this, Lisa immediately apologized to him. He asked if she had tried to attack him. With a surprised look, she explained that it had been a misunderstanding. She did not want to hurt him. He started to show the folded gold coin to her, and with an unhappy look asked if she was going to take responsibility for it. Upon hearing this, Lisa began to cry and started to regret it. The hotel had a hallway that was lit by torches. Lisa opened the basement door, reached out towards the stairs, and explained that he could reach the cage if he followed the stairs. She also took out a shiny square-shaped pendant, which was the VIP badge. Cyan turned his head towards her, and upon seeing the pendant, began to extend his hand towards it and with a confused look asked what it was used for. Cyan took the pendant in his hand, and Lisa crossed her arms, closed her eyes, and explained that they gave this pendant to customers who use special rooms. Cyan would be quite secure if he kept it with him. She opened her eyes and with an uncertain look mentioned that although she was not sure why he wanted to visit the cage so urgently, she suggested it was better for him not to go there unless he had multiple lives. After saying this, she wished him good luck. Cyan started to observe her and paid no attention as he preferred to do his own thing. He brought his hand close to his mouth and decided to take this as a threat, and assured not to forget it. Lisa turned her back, gritted her teeth, started to walk away, and could not help but feel furious. He started to look at the stairs and decided it was time to go to the cage. Karam manifested, and with a serious look she asked why he didn't ask Lisa to bring the owner. She began to remember Miss' secret card. Sarika's order had been to take out the owner of the cage Lambaster by any means. Linz Nihaloff was the masked individual and owner of the cage Lambaster. They started to descend down the stairs, and he said that they couldn't do this since there were no clues about her at all. Karam could not help but feel furious and with a look full of rage asked why she had given such an enigmatic order. Cyan stopped walking and explained that they were going to discover the reason soon. She was somewhat confused since he made this sound as if he knew this place. He began to remember his past life. The reality was that he had come to this place several times in his past life. He came with his army and they stood on top of a cliff. The whole city was in flames as it had collapsed due to the war. She started to look at him and with a serene look asked how much mess there was in this area. He began to look down and replied that they were going to find out soon. A while later, they arrived at the door of the true Lambaster cage, and an immense pressure began to be felt throughout the air. At the same time, a man who had a scar on his mouth and was holding a cigarette in his hand began to smile, asking if a young boy had done this to both of them. In front of him was kneeling the criminal who had tried to assault Cyan. He placed his hands on his knees and responded with a yes. This had happened near the entrance of the city. According to him, Cyan was not an ordinary boy. His boss was a man with white hair. He intertwined his hands and with a serious look asked if a child like him was in the Lambaster cage. His subordinate bowed his head before him. They had tried to do everything they could, but Cyan had reserved a VIP room, so they could do nothing about it. The boss, who had one hand resting on his knee, put the other under his chin and began to think, questioning whether Cyan was a son of a noble house. His subordinate, who had a face full of bruises and swollen eyes, started to cry and replied that he wasn't sure. He was somewhat upset and asked Gunther to please help them. He started to wipe his tears with his hand, lowered his head again before him and explained that he couldn't even walk in public looking like this. Upon hearing this, Gunther agreed to help since for him this was quite interesting. His eyes filled with emotion. He stood up, started to crack his fingers, and with a smile decided to head to the cage immediately as he was interested in seeing how Cyan looked. At the same time in the cage, a fight was being carried out. The brown-haired girl gave her opponent a strong kick in the face, winning the fight and making the crowd go wild. Everyone raised their fists and began to shout with excitement. She was Linda Weasley. She was a very muscular woman. Her opponent fell defeated in the ring. She placed her foot on his head, started showing her biceps, and began to scream with excitement. In the audience, Cyan and Karam were also present. Upon observing this fight, she no longer had any doubt as to why this town had fallen. Cyan explained that betting on fights like this attracted a lot of attention after all. Cyan placed his hand on the railing, and with a calm look revealed that he had come here for this reason. Upon hearing this, Karam's eyes filled with confusion. With a puzzled look, she asked what he was talking about. He began to point at himself with his finger and with an intense gaze full of emotion started to show a smile. It was very difficult to approach Linz Nihaloff. They could make her come to them instead. Karam could not help but be somewhat surprised and go on alert. She disappeared, and while Cyan was watching the fight, a man with dreadlocks appeared and caught his attention. Not long after, a bald and muscular man also started to approach them. The man with dreadlocks clenched his fists, and with a serious look explained to Cyan that this was not a place for children. Upon hearing his voice, Cyan turned his head towards them, and seeing this, he felt happy as they had arrived at the right moment. Just before the man could say another word, he approached and gave him a strong punch in the stomach, causing him intense pain and making him start to bleed. He fell to his knees on the ground and began to writhe in pain, seeing that his companion had been attacked. The bald man started running towards Cyan, asking what he was doing to Jason. Cyan grabbed Jason by the hair and lifted his head, making him start to feel immense fear. Cyan clenched his fist, began to show a murderous look, and with a smile prepared to hit. Jason tried to apologize, but it was in vain. Cyan gave him a strong punch in the face using all his strength. His blow was so strong that Jason lost several teeth and started bleeding from the nose. Upon seeing this, the bald man panicked and began to sweat. Cyan released Jason's head, causing him to fall backward onto the ground. Now that one was out of combat, he started wiping the blood he had under his chin with his hand, stared intently at the man, and with a smile asked where he had to sign to fight instead of just standing by or betting. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.